Good evening, boys and ghouls. That's the catchphrase of a different handsome fellow. Me, I suppose I don't have one yet. But while we are on the topic of infringement, how about I tell you a few tales from my favorite book, as it is the Halloween season. No, not this one, although it does have its fair share of fans. But instead I'll be sharing my favorite scary stories to tell in the dark. Now let us begin this evening, as most pleasant evenings do, with a tale of lost love, in cold as clay. A farmer had a daughter for whom he cared more than anything on earth. She fell in love with a farmhand named Jim, but the farmer did not think Jim was good enough for his daughter. To keep them apart, he sent her to live with her uncle on the other side of the county. Soon after she left, Jim got sick, and he wasted away and died. Everyone said he died of a broken heart. The farmer felt so guilty about Jim's death, he could not tell his daughter what had happened. She continued to think about Jim and the life they might have together. One night, many weeks later, there was a knock on her uncle's door. When the girl opened the door, Jim was standing there. "Your father asked me to come get you," he said. "I came on his best horse." "Is there anything wrong?" she asked. "I don't know," he said. She packed a few things and they left. She rode behind him, clinging to his waist. Soon he complained of a headache. "It aches something terrible," he told her. She put her hand on his forehead. "Why, you're as cold as clay," she said. "I hope you're not ill." And she wrapped her handkerchief around his head. They traveled so swiftly that in a few hours they reached the farm. The girl quickly dismounted and knocked on the door. Her father was startled to see her. "Didn't you send for me?" she asked. "No, I didn't," he said. She turned to Jim, but he was gone, and so was the horse. They went to the stable to look for them. The horse was there. It was covered with sweat and trembling with fear. But there was no sign of Jim. Terrified, her father told her the truth about Jim's death. Then quickly he went to see Jim's parents. They decided to open his grave. The corpse was in its coffin, but around his head they found the girl's handkerchief. A tale all too familiar. One ride with your fiancé, and you're begging to spend the rest of eternity in your casket instead. Go fig. But I say, what is the rush of trying to get married right away? In our next tale, we'll see the horrors of what a first date can bring in The Hook. Donald and Sarah went to the movies. Then they went for a ride in Donald's car. They parked up a hill at the edge of town. From there they could see the lights up and down the valley. Donald turned on the radio and found some music, but an announcer broke in with a news bulletin. A murderer had escaped from the state prison. He was armed with a knife and was headed south on foot. His left hand was missing. In its place, he wore a hook. "Let's roll up the windows and lock the doors," said Sarah. "It's a good idea," said Donald. "That prison isn't too far away," said Sarah. "Maybe we should really go home." "But it's only 10 o'clock, said Donald. "I don't care what time it is," she said. "I want to go home." "Look, Sarah," said Donald, "he's not going to climb all the way up here. Why would he do that? Even if he did, all the doors are locked. How would he get in?" "Donald, he could take that hook and break through a window and open a car door," she said. "I'm scared, and I want to go home." Donald was annoyed. "Girls are always afraid of something," he said. As he started the car, Sarah thought she heard someone, or rather something, scratching at her door. "Did you hear that?" she asked as they roared away. "It sounded like somebody was trying to get in." "Oh, sure," said Donald. Soon they got to her house. "Would you like to come in and have some cocoa?" she asked. "Nah," he said. "I gotta go home." He went around to the other side of the car to let her out. Hanging on the door handle was a hook. Now, I've been on plenty bad first dates, but this one would have me scratching to get away. In fact, sometimes it's simply best to be alone. Being around 1, 2, or 3, or even crowds of people is just hazardous to one's health. As we find out in Room for One More. A man named Joseph Blackwell came to Philadelphia on a business trip. He stayed with friends in the big house they owned outside the city. That night, they had a good time visiting, but when Blackwell went to bed, he tossed and turned and couldn't sleep. Sometime during the night, he heard a car turn into the driveway. He went to the window to see who was arriving at such a late hour. In the moonlight, he saw a long black hearse filled with people. The driver of this hearse looked up to him. When Blackwell saw this queer, hideous face, he shuddered. The driver called to him, "There's room for one more," then waited for a minute or two. Then he drove off. In the morning, Blackwell told his friends what had happened. "You were dreaming," they said. "I must have been," he said, "but it didn't seem like a dream." After breakfast, he went into Philadelphia. He spent the day high above the city in one of the new office buildings there. Late in the afternoon, he was waiting for an elevator to take him down to the street, but when it arrived, it was very crowded. One of the passengers looked out and called to him. "There's room for one more," he said. It was the driver of the hearse. "No thanks," said Blackwell. "I'll get the next one." The doors closed and the elevator started down. There was shrieking and screaming, then the sound of a crash. The elevator had fallen to the bottom of the shaft. Everyone on board was killed. And that, my friends, is why I feel it's best to be alone. And on that note, I bid you adieu and have a very pleasant evening. Until next time. Welcome back, friends. Please, come into my home for some more scary stories. Though I should warn you, always be careful which dwellings you enter. Some hold more secrets than they should. Just as in the case of our first story, The Haunted House. One time a preacher went to see if he could put a haunt to rest at a house in a settlement. The house had been haunted for about 10 years. Several people had tried to stay there all night, but they always would get scared out by the haunt. So this preacher took his Bible and went to the house. Went on in, built himself a good fire and lit a lamp. He sat there reading the Bible. Then, just before midnight, he heard something start up in the cellar, walking back and forth, back and forth. Then it sounded like somebody was trying to scream and got choked off. Then there was a lot of thrashing around and struggling. Finally, everything got quiet. The old preacher took up his Bible again, but before he could start reading, he heard footsteps coming up from the cellar stairs. He watched the door to the cellar, and the footsteps kept coming closer and closer. He saw the doorknob turn, and when the door began to open, he jumped up and hollered, "What do you want?" The door shut back easy-like, and there wasn't a sound. The preacher was trembling a little, but he finally opened the Bible and read a while. Then he got up and laid the book on the chair and went to mending the fire. Then the haunt started walking again, and step, step, step up the cellar stairs. The old preacher sat watching the door, saw the doorknob turn, and the door open. It looked like a young woman. He backed up and said, "Who are you? What do you want?" The haunt sort of swayed like she didn't know what to do. Then she just faded out. The preacher waited and waited. and when he didn't hear any more noises, he went over and shut the door. He was sweating and trembling all over, but he was a brave man and he thought he'd be able to see it through. So he turned his chair to where he could watch, and he sat down and waited. It wasn't long before he heard the haunt start up again, slowly. Step, 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 step closer and closer. Step, step. And it was right at the door. The preacher stood up and held his Bible out before him. Then the knob slowly turned, and the door opened wide. This time the preacher spoke quiet-like. He said, "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, who are you, and what do you want?" The haunt came right across the room, straight to him, and took a hold of his coat. It was a young woman about 20 years old. Her hair was torn and tangled, and the flesh was dropping off her face so he could see the bones and part of her teeth. She had no eyeballs, but there was sort of blue light back in her eye sockets, and she had no nose to her face. Then she started talking. It sounded like her voice was coming and going with the wind blowing it. She told how her lover had killed her for her money and buried her in the cellar. She said if the preacher would dig up her bones and bury her properly, she could rest. Then he told her to take the end of the little finger from her left hand and lay it in the collection plate at the next church meeting, and he'd find out who had murdered her. And she said, "If you come back here once more after that, you'll hear my voice at midnight, and I'll tell you where my money is hid, and you can give it to the church." The haunt sobbed like she was tired, and she sunk down toward the floor and was gone. The preacher found her bones and buried them in the graveyard. The next Sunday, the preacher put the finger bone in the collection plate, and when a certain man happened to touch it, it stuck to his hand. The man jumped up and rubbed and scraped and tore at that bone, trying to get it off. Then he went to screaming, like he was going crazy. Well, he confessed to the murder, and they took him to jail. After the man was hung, the preacher went back to the house one midnight, and the haunt's voice told him to dig under the hearth rock. He did, and he found a big sack of money. And where the haunt had held on to his coat, the print of those bony fingers was burned right into the cloth. It never did come out. Let this be a warning. Always be careful whom you fall in love with. It might not be worth it. In fact, many times, it's just not quite worth it trying to impress others. Just like in our next story, the white satin evening gown. A young man invited a young woman to a formal dance, but she was very poor, and she could not afford to buy the evening gown she needed for such an occasion. "Maybe you can rent a dress," her mother said. So she went to a pawn shop not far from where she lived. She found a white satin evening gown in her size. She looked lovely in it, and she was able to rent it for very little. When she arrived at the dance with her friends, she was so attractive everybody wanted to meet her. She danced again and again and was having a wonderful time. But then she began to feel dizzy and faint, and she asked her friend to take her home. "I think you have danced too much," she said. When she got home, she lay down on her bed. The next morning, her mother found that her daughter had died. The doctor did not understand what had caused her death, so he had the coroner perform an autopsy. The coroner found that she had been poisoned by embalming fluid. It had stopped her blood from flowing. There were traces of the fluid on her dress. He decided it had entered her skin when she perspired while dancing. The pawnbroker said he bought the dress from an undertaker's helper. It had been used in a funeral for another young woman, and the helper had stolen it just before she was buried. Oh, the lengths we go to impress others, simply not worth it, especially in our next tale, The Girl Who Stood on a Grave. Some boys and girls were at a party one night. There was a graveyard down the street, and they were talking about how scary it was. "Don't ever stand on a grave after dark," one of the boys said. "The person inside will grab you. He'll pull you under." "That's not true," one of the girls said. "It's just superstition." "I'll give you $1 if you stand on a grave," said the boy. "A grave doesn't scare me," said the girl. "I'll do it right now." The boy handed her his knife. "Stick this knife in one of the graves," he said. "We'll know you were there." The graveyard was filled with shadows, and was as quiet as death. "There's nothing to be scared of," the girl told herself, but she was scared anyway. She picked out a grave and stood on it. Then quickly she bent over and plunged the knife into the soil, and she started to leave. But she couldn't get away. Something was holding her back. She tried a second time to leave, but she couldn't move. She was filled with terror. "Something has me!" she screamed, and she fell to the ground. When she didn't come back, the others went to look for her. They found her body sprawled across the grave. Without realizing it, she had plunged the knife through her skirt and pinned it to the ground. It was only the knife that had held her, and she had died of fright. And on that note, I too feel I could fall dead asleep. So I bid you good evening. Until next time. Welcome back. It's always such a pleasure to have people over. Although that is not always the case, as in our first story for the evening, The Guests. A young man and his wife were on a trip to visit his mother. Usually they arrived in time for supper, but they had gotten a late start, and now it was getting dark, so they decided to look for a place to stay overnight and go on in the morning. Just off the road they saw a small house in the woods. "Maybe they rent rooms," the wife said, so they stopped to ask. An elderly man and woman came to the door. They didn't rent rooms, they said, but they would be glad to have them stay overnight as their guests. They had plenty of room, and they would enjoy the company. The old woman made coffee and brought out some cake, and the four of them talked for a while. Then the young couple were taken to their room. They again explained that they wanted to pay for this, but the old man said he would not accept the money. The young couple got up early the next morning before their hosts had awakened. On a table near the front door they left an envelope with some money in it for the room. They went on to the next town. They stopped in a restaurant and had breakfast. When they told the owner where they had stayed, he was shocked. "That can't be," he said. "That house is burned to the ground, and the man and the woman who lived there died in the fire." The young couple could not believe it, so they went back to the house. Only there was no house. All they found was a burned-out shell. They stood staring at the ruins, trying to understand what had happened. Then the woman screamed. In the rubble was a badly burned table, like the one they had seen by the front door, and on that table was the envelope they had left that morning. See, when you have good manners, people are dying to help you out. I was lucky my mother taught me manners at a very young age, although I didn't always approve of some of the babysitters she left me with. Which brings us to our next story. The Babysitter. It was 9 o'clock in the evening. Everybody was sitting on the couch in front of the TV. There was Richard, Brian, Jenny, and Doreen, the babysitter. The telephone rang. "Maybe it's your mother," said Doreen. She picked up the phone. Before she could say a word, a man laughed hysterically and hung up. "Who was it?" asked Richard. "Some nut," said Doreen. "So what'd I miss?" At 9:30 the telephone rang again. Doreen answered it. It was the man who had called before. "I'll be there soon," he said. He laughed and hung up the phone. "Who was it?" the child asked. "Some crazy person," she said. About 10 o'clock the phone rang again. Jenny got to it first. "Hello," she said. It was the same man. "1 more hour," he said, and he laughed and hung up. He said, "1 more hour, what did he mean?" asked Jenny. "Don't worry," said Doreen. "It's somebody fooling around." "I'm scared," said Jenny. About 10:30, the telephone rang once more. When Doreen picked it up, the man said, "Pretty soon now," and he laughed. "Why are you doing this?" Doreen screamed, and he hung up. "Was it that guy again?" asked Brian. "Yes," said Doreen. "I'm going to call the operator and complain." The operator told her to call back if it happened again, and she would try to trace the call. At 11 o'clock, the telephone rang again. Doreen answered it. "Very soon now," the man said, and he laughed and hung up. Doreen called the operator. Almost at once, she called back. "That person is calling from a telephone upstairs," she said. "You'd better leave. I'll call the police." Just then, a door opened. A man they had never seen before started walking down the stairs towards them. As they ran from the house, he was smiling in a very strange way. A few minutes later, the police found him and arrested him. See, it's never a problem to ask for help, no matter what situation you're in. Just like in the case of the ghost with the bloody fingers. A businessman arrived at a hotel late one night and asked for a room. The room clerk told him that the hotel was all filled up. "There's only one empty room," he said. "But we don't rent that one because it's haunted." "I'll take it," said the businessman. "I don't believe in ghosts." The man went up to the room. He unpacked his things and he went to bed. As soon as he did, a ghost came out of the closet. Its fingers were bleeding, and it was moaning, "Bloody fingers, bloody fingers." When the man saw the ghost, he grabbed his things and ran. The next night, a woman arrived very late. Again, all the rooms were taken except the haunted room. "I'll sleep there," she said. "I'm not afraid of ghosts." As soon as she got into bed, the ghost came out of the closet. Its fingers were still bleeding. It still was moaning, "Bloody fingers, bloody fingers." And the woman took one look and ran. A week later, another guest arrived, very late. He also took the haunted room. After he unpacked, he got out his guitar and began to play. Soon the ghost appeared. As before, its fingers were bleeding, and it was moaning, "Bloody fingers, bloody fingers." The man paid no attention. He kept strumming his guitar. But the ghost kept moaning, and its fingers kept bleeding. Finally, the guitar player looked up and said, "Cool it, man. Go get yourself a Band-Aid." What can I say? Accidents happen. Always good to have emergency supplies on hand. Just like in our next story, A New Horse. Two farmhands shared a room. One slept at the back of the room, the other slept near the door. After a while, the one who slept near the door began to feel very tired early in the day. His friend asked him what was wrong. "An awful thing happens every night," he said. "A witch turns me into a horse and rides me all over the countryside." "I'll sleep in your bed tonight," his friend said. "We'll see what happens to me." About midnight, an old woman who lived nearby came into the room. She mumbled some strange words over the farmhand, and he found he couldn't move. Then she slipped a bridle on him, and he turned into a horse. The next thing he knew, he was riding him across the fields at breakneck speed, beating him to make him go even faster. Soon, they came to a house where a party was going on. There was a lot of music and dancing. They were having a big time inside. She hitched him to a fence and went in. While she was gone, the farmhand rubbed against the fence until the bridle came off, and he turned back into a human being. Then he went into the house and found the witch. He spoke those strange words over her, and with the bridle, he turned her into a horse. Then he rode her to a blacksmith and had her fitted with horseshoes. After that, he rode her to the farm where she lived. "I have a pretty good filly here," he told her husband, "but I need a stronger horse. Would you like to trade?" The old man looked her over and said he would do it. So they picked out another horse, and the farmhand rode away. Her husband led his new horse into the barn. He took off the bridle, went to hang it up, but when he came back, the new horse was gone. Instead, there stood his wife, with horseshoes nailed to her hands and feet. And with that, This old horse needs to make his own way to bed. Have a pleasant evening. Until next time.